So today is our last video in our Army of Northern Virginia series. So thanks for joining me on this series. I know it took long, but as I said before, we had a lot going on with the Queen dying, the freaking hurricane, all this stuff. But now we're finally finishing our series on Robert E. Lee and his army. So thank you for watching. Please like, share, and comment. If you're a new subscriber, it'd be great for you to join our ever-growing community of history lovers. I will like my Army of the Potomac series, as well as my Gettysburg series. I will make a playlist with all these videos in it at once. I also do now have a playlist of all the biographies I've done, so feel more than welcome to check those out. Thanks for joining us, and let's begin with the spring of 1864. Lee and his army had now reorganized. James Longstreet and his corps had now returned from the west, following the fall of Chattanooga. Now Lee and the Confederacy only had one option remaining to end the war. It was for the Army of Northern Virginia to last long enough that hopefully Abraham Lincoln loses the election of 1864, and the Democratic nominee George B. McClellan and George Pendleton will bring a negotiated peace if they win. But the Union front has also changed. Though George Meade was still in command of the Army of the Potomac, Henry Halleck was replaced as commander of all Union forces. Ulysses S. Grant is now the commanding general of all Union forces, and instead of stationing himself in Washington as his predecessor, he stationed himself with the Army of the Potomac. Now, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill were both of the opinion Grant was going to be just like the others, no different, just like all the other Union generals they had defeated. But Longstreet deferred. One, he had just come from the west where he was defeated by forces commanded by Grant. Second, more importantly, Longstreet was Grant's best friend, and Grant was married to Longstreet's cousin. He knew him intimately. So Lee decided to take all the men's word and decided to move, but move cautiously. On May 5th, 1864, they engaged with Grant and Meade at the Battle of the Wilderness. It was the third time they would be fighting over this ground. In the heat of the fighting, the forest lit on fire, trapping soldiers from both armies, burning them alive. Also, General Longstreet was wounded, similarly to Stonewall Jackson, by his own men, but also a few hundred yards where Jackson was actually shot. After 2 days of fighting, the Army of the Potomac began to withdraw. But to Lee's shock, the soldiers began to march south instead of north. The next few actions would either be inconclusive or Confederate defeats. But something else had begun. General Lee had become ill. He had contracted dysentery and was becoming unable to physically move. So he and the Army of Northern Virginia, instead of playing cat and mouse with Grant and Meade, instead Lee got to a small tavern near Mechanicsville, Virginia, on May 31st. The tavern was called Cold Harbor. Lee gave instructions to General Jubal Early, Richard Anderson, and A.P. Hill to begin digging in. Jubal Early in the north positioned his forces north of Shady Grove Road, stretching south to the Walnut Grove Road. Between his corps and Anderson's was Pickett's division, or what remained of Pickett's division, a little south of Walnut Grove Road. Anderson was then sitting west of Beulah Church, where it ran south connecting with John C. Breckinridge's division that had been called into support, and then A.P. Hill's corps, whose defenses ended on Turkey Hill. Now again, Lee physically was so ill he could not move. Now, many people still don't exactly know why, but Grant and Meade decided not to do reconnaissance, even with men like Winfield Scott Hancock begging them to. But they decided not to. Instead, they committed all corps of the army to do an outright assault on the Confederates' position, believing they were defeated. However, the Union Army would be massacred across open ground in line order. The Confederates cut down the Union troops. On the 7th of June, Lee and Grant agreed to a truce so they could collect the dead across the battlefield. Union and Confederate troops met across the field and talked to one another, and it was actually a very beautiful moment. Kind of like the Christmas truce in World War One. They were playing around with each other, having a good time, and some of the Confederates were even assisting the Union in moving the corpses of their comrades. The Union Army had suffered over 12,700 casualties, the greatest victory the Army of Northern Virginia will have in what became known as the Overland Campaign. They would tactically defeat the Union at Trevelyan Station, Virginia, on June 12th. But then again, the campaign was over now, because Lee noticed something. Grant and his 125,000 men had crossed the James River south of Richmond. Finally, he made the connection. Grant was looking to seize the railroad hub of Petersburg, Virginia, so then he could move on Richmond. So Lee quickly redirected his army towards the city of Petersburg, Virginia. He also gave orders to General P.G.T. Beauregard and his Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia to move in to intercept Grant. Luckily he did, and a long siege began, one that would last 9 months, and in time Grant would end the idea of winter quarters in the U.S. military doctrine. But at this point, something else had also started. Grant's policy of total war began to take effect. This resulted in the abuse on the civilians of the South. Now, the whole point of total war, a small part, I would say, of total war, was to encourage desertions. Because it was clear if men believed their family were in danger, they would leave to go protect them. After 9 months of siege and constant battling, including such famous things like the Crater, which, if you look at our Army of the Potomac video, it explains a little better. Lee made a desperate attempt to break the siege. General Gordon, directed by Lee, was sent to attack the Union positions at a redoubt called Fort Stedman. I've actually been there and walked the ramparts, and you see the actual ground, you realize how desperate they were. The attack would of course fail. But Lee, later with his remaining forces, withdrew in an attempt to join with General Joseph E. Johnston's forces in the southern states. Beginning the final campaign, the Appomattox, at the Third Battle of Petersburg, General A.P. Hill, a Lee favorite, will be killed. And Lee with his army will continue to engage federal forces of Phil Sheridan and George Meade. On April 4th, 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond fell. Abraham Lincoln, winning his re-election campaign, entered the abandoned city victoriously. On April 9th, what remained of the Army of Northern Virginia deployed for one last fight. As the men of the Army of the Potomac, Army of the James, and Army of Shenandoah came down upon them, Lee knew it was over. There was no regrouping at Johnston, no hopes of strong defensive positions. There was nothing left to do. A member of James Longstreet's staff was sent to Grant, and hostilities were seized. Many of the Confederate officers begged before the truce for Lee not to, many saying they would go on to the very end. But Lee simply said, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die a thousand deaths." Lee would then, after hours of dispatches back and forth between Grant and himself, finally, they decided on where to meet. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Lee accepted the conditions of surrender, which Lincoln had directed Grant to give. Not too harsh, and simply allow the Confederate Army and its officers to go home. Lee would agree, signing the official surrender and also laying out a timeline of when they will surrender their arms and colors to the Army of the Potomac, who Grant felt earned the right to accept the surrender. On April 12th, 1865, what remained of the Army of Northern Virginia began the ceremonial surrender of the war. Under the supervision of Brevet Major General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Chamberlain called it the last salute. Though enemies for these past 4 years, the Union Army had gained a great level of respect for their foes. This will be their grand review, as they were disbanded and sent home. After the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, the war will continue until May 26, 1865, when the final Confederate forces would finally stand down and surrender. The Army of Northern Virginia achieved great feats in its service. It had invaded the North twice, crushed a force double its size at Fredericksburg and then again at Chancellorsville. Had Gettysburg gone a different way, maybe history would be different. But on April 12th, the 28,000 remaining troops marched home, defeated. Thanks for watching. This will be the end to our Army of Northern Virginia series. Now, again, I will do future videos on each battle, but for this time, I'm actually going to relax on the Civil War content. Don't want to become just a Civil War channel. But thanks for joining us. Please like, share, and comment. Subscribe if you are new to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.